What if Adam was not the first man, not the first to breathe this air, not the first to walk this earth, but the first to be remembered? Genesis begins like a door suddenly opened, in the beginning. But what if that beginning is already mid-story, a world already formed, landscapes already aged, silence that feels like something has been erased? Then comes the voice, "Let us make man in our image," us, who was already there when humanity was created. And why does the text never explain it? Because buried between the lines of Scripture is a possibility, quiet, unsettling, and almost never spoken. Adam may have entered a world that was not empty, a world with echoes of something before. And if that's true, then the story of humanity doesn't begin with creation. It begins with inheritance. So before we follow Adam into Eden, we must confront the world that existed before him. We don't begin with Adam, we begin with a tension hidden in the text, a fracture most readers never notice. Genesis 1 speaks in sweeping cosmic rhythm. Light bursts into existence, waters divide, land rises, and then humanity appears, male and female. He created them, together, complete, placed into a world already prepared. But then, the narrative resets. Genesis 2 slows down. The language shifts. The tone becomes intimate, almost surgical. And suddenly there is no crowd, no humanity in fullness. Only one man, Adam, formed from dust, alone in a garden that feels isolated from the rest of creation. Different order, different sequence, different voice. And the question emerges like a shadow behind the words, why would the same story be told twice differently unless it isn't the same story at all? What if Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are not two perspectives of one event, but two distinct moments separated by something unspoken? One humanity created in fullness, male and female, plural, expansive. 2. Adam formed later, singular, intentional, set apart. If that is true, then Adam is not the beginning of humanity. He is the beginning of a lineage, a chosen line, placed into an already existing world. And suddenly the silence in the text begins to feel intentional. Because Genesis never actually says the earth was empty. It says the earth was formless and void, tohu, vabohu. But that word tohu does not simply mean unfinished. It can mean chaotic, desolate, even ruined. A world not at its beginning, but at the aftermath of something. And now the question shifts again. What if creation in Genesis 1 is not the first creation, but a restoration, a reordering of something that had already fallen into disorder? This idea is not new. Ancient Jewish interpreters wrestled with it. Some early traditions whispered never fully preserved, hinted at a time before Adam, a world that did not endure, a history that collapsed into silence, not recorded, not explained, only replaced. Because Genesis does something unusual. It moves forward without looking back. No mention of what came before the chaos. No explanation of why the earth needed ordering. Only action. Only restoration. Only continuation. And that absence is deafening, because in ancient storytelling, silence is never accidental. It is selective. The narrative is not trying to tell everything. It is choosing what matters, and what it chooses is Adam, a man placed into a garden that feels less like the whole world and more like a controlled space within it, a sacred enclosure, a beginning inside a larger unspoken reality. And Adam himself reflects this tension. He is formed, not born, placed, not spread, commissioned, not multiplied, at least not yet. Almost as if his purpose is not simply to exist, but to represent something, to begin something new within something already old. And then comes the command, to tend, to keep, to guard. Guard. What? from what the text does not say. But the language implies something subtle. Eden is not just a gift. It is a boundary, a protected space in a world that may not be entirely safe. And if that is true, then Adam is not entering an untouched paradise. He is stepping into a restored zone within a wider, more complex world. A world that may already carry history. A world that may already carry memory. A world that may already carry others. And suddenly the opening chapters of Genesis begin to feel less like a simple beginning and more like the middle of a story we were never fully told. A story where creation is also recovery, where silence hides history, where Adam is not the first to exist but the first to be chosen. And if Adam entered a world already shaped, then the question we must now face is far more unsettling: who or what shaped it before him? The word at the center of Genesis is more mysterious than most readers realize, not because it is hidden, but because it has been seen too quickly. The text does not begin with a lonely divine monologue spoken into emptiness. It begins with a name, Elohim, a word grammatically plural, yet often governing singular action. A mystery inside the very first sentence of Scripture, power expressed as one, yet surrounded by language that refuses to feel simple. And then comes the line that has unsettled readers for centuries: "Let us make man in our image, not my image, our." That one word opens a chamber of questions the text never fully closes. Who is the U.S.? Why does the Creator speak in the language of assembly? And why does the birth of humanity sound less like a solitary act, and more like a decree issued before witnesses? In the ancient Near Eastern world, kings did not always speak alone. Great decisions were announced in the presence of a court. Thrones were surrounded by attendants, scribes, messengers, and servants of the palace. In the Hebrew Bible itself, there are moments when heaven is described not as an empty abstraction, but as a realm alive with order, rank, and presence. The prophets later glimpse at hosts of heaven's seraphim crying out, "Sons of God," standing before the Lord, a divine council gathered around the throne. Suddenly, Genesis no longer sounds isolated from the rest of Scripture. It sounds like the opening move of a pattern. Not many gods, not rivals to the Most High, but a supreme God speaking before a heavenly assembly, a council, a courtroom above creation. And if that is true, then the creation of humanity was never a private event. It was announced in the presence of other beings, witnessed, observed, perhaps even received as a declaration of immense consequence. Because imagine the tension of that moment. Heaven watching, the earth newly ordered beneath them, and then the decree humanity will bear the image. Not angels, not the stars, not the powers above, dust, living dust, fragile, mortal, earthbound creatures, given a status that touches both heaven and earth. That is not a small detail, because in the ancient world, an image was not merely a reflection, it was representation. Kings placed images of themselves in distant lands to declare authority. Temples held images to signify divine rule. So when Genesis says humanity was made in the image of God, it is saying something staggering. The human being was appointed as a living sign of divine kingship on earth. And that means Adam did not enter the story as a random creature among other creatures. He entered as a figure already charged with meaning, a priestly king in seed form, a human placed under heaven's gaze. And now the world around him feels different, not empty, not neutral, but already known, already surveyed by watchers from above, already part of a larger drama in which heaven and earth are not separated by silence, but joined by purpose. This is where the mystery deepens, because if humanity was created in the presence of heavenly beings, then Adam's arrival was not just the start of biology, it was the launch of a vocation. And vocations create tension, because whenever one role is elevated, every other witness must respond to it. To be made in God's image in full view of heaven is not just an honor, it is an announcement, a transfer of responsibility, a declaration that earth will now be governed through humanity in a way that changes the balance of the story. And perhaps that is why the earliest chapters of Genesis feel so charged even before the fall. Because the stage was never empty. Adam was never alone in the deepest sense. He was seen, known, placed into a world already alive with invisible attention. If other beings stood in the background before Adam ever spoke his first word, then humanity was never alone at the beginning. Never alone in the garden, never alone in history. If this thought unsettles you, good. Because truth often does. Write what you feel, not to convince anyone, but to mark the moment you realize the story might be deeper than you were told. But the most mysterious clue is not in heaven. It's on earth waiting for us in the footsteps of Cain. Cain leaves. He leaves with blood still echoing behind him. Abel is dead. The ground has opened its mouth. And for the first time in the biblical story, human violence is no longer a possibility. It is a fact. A brother has fallen by a brother's hand, and the world outside Eden suddenly feels larger, darker, and more populated than the text has yet admitted. Then Cain says something that should stop every careful reader in their tracks. Whoever finds me will kill me. Whoever. Not his father, not his mother, not some distant son, not yet born. Whoever finds me. It is one of the most unsettling lines in Genesis because it assumes a human landscape wider than the narrative has described. Cain speaks as if the earth beyond his family is not empty wilderness, but inhabited ground territory where he may be recognized, hunted, and answered with vengeance. And this is where the text begins to feel like a doorway left half open. Because if there are no others, Cain's fear makes little sense. But if there were always others unmentioned, unnamed outside the direct line of the story, then his words become terrifyingly clear. Cain is not afraid of fantasy. He is afraid of people, real people. This is not proof in the modern scientific sense. It is something more ancient and more biblical narrative pressure, the kind of pressure that reveals what the text assumes without pausing to explain it. The writer does not stop to solve Cain's fear because perhaps within the world of the story the answer was already understood. Then the mystery deepens. Cain goes east of Eden into the land of Nod. Eastward again, the biblical direction of exile, wandering separation. But exile only has meaning if there is somewhere to go. And Cain does not vanish into emptiness. He settles, he builds, he names. He builds a city, not a tent, not a lonely shelter, a city. And cities do not rise for one man and his grief. Cities require structure, labor, memory, offspring, exchange, continuity. A city is not merely architecture. It is human density made visible. It is the sign of an existing social world. So who lived there? Who joined him? Who filled the streets of the first city built by the first murderer? This is where a different possibility emerges, not as dogma, but as a provocative frame that helps the text breathe. What if Adam was not the first biological human, but the first covenant-bearing human, the first man placed within sacred assignment, the first man called not merely to live, but to stand in a defined relationship with God as the representative head of a chosen line? If that is true, then those outside Eden were not less human. They were outside a particular vocation, outside a particular covenant horizon. Human, yes, but not positioned in the narrative the same way Adam was. Adam is no longer the beginning of humanity in the broadest biological sense. He is the beginning of a relationship through which the biblical drama of sin calling exile, promise, and redemption will unfold. That is why Genesis follows his line so intensely, not because no one else exists, but because this line is the one the text has chosen to track. And Cain stands at the fracture point, born from Adam's house, yet building beyond it, marked by the covenant story, yet moving into a broader human field. He becomes the bridge between two worlds, the sacred memory of Eden and the expanding human world outside its gates. One world defined by calling, the other by survival culture, violence, invention, and distance. Cain carries both. He bears the wound of revelation, but he also becomes founder, builder, ancestor of music makers, metal workers, city dwellers. In him, civilization begins under a shadow. Human culture does not emerge in innocence, but in exile. Not away from humanity, but in the midst of it. The Bible's first city is built not by a hero, but by a fugitive, which means the story has never been as simple as first man, first family, empty earth. It has always hinted at something wider, something older, something standing just beyond the frame. But if others existed, if the ground beyond Eden already held human life, why does Genesis keep them in the shadows? Why does Scripture let us hear their footsteps, but never show us their faces? The Bible is not trying to tell everything. That is the mistake modern readers often make when they come to Genesis expecting a total history of the human race, a complete census of beginnings, a documentary of every life that breathed beneath the first sky. But Genesis is doing something far more focused and far more theological. It is not telling all history, it is telling sacred history, covenant history. And once you see that the silence stops looking like a flaw, it begins to look like design. Because Scripture often moves this way. It narrows, it selects, it passes over whole nations in a sentence, then lingers over one family, one promise, one wound, one birth. The biblical text is not driven by modern curiosity. It is driven by redemptive purpose. It asks not what happened everywhere, but where is the line through which God's relationship with humanity will now unfold? That line is Adam's, not because no one else mattered in a human sense, but because this is the lineage the narrative has chosen to follow. And suddenly, what is left out becomes as important as what is included. The unnamed people beyond Cain's fear, the wider world implied by cities' wandering and settlement, the ancient possibility of a humanity outside the garden's immediate story. All of it recedes into silence not because it did not exist, but because it was not the focus of this text's mission. This is not deception, it is selection, a theological lens. The same way a torch in a dark cave does not deny the cave beyond its beam, it simply reveals the path you are meant to follow. Genesis shines that torch on Adam, then Seth, then Noah, then Abraham. The beam is narrow on purpose. The Bible is tracing covenant, not cataloging every parallel human thread. It is following the line through which exile, promise, judgment, mercy, and finally redemption will be understood. And this changes the emotional texture of the opening chapters. Genesis reads less like the beginning of everything that ever existed, and more like the beginning of something chosen within a larger world, a chosen relationship, a chosen burden, a chosen calling. That is why the story feels both intimate and enormous at once. It speaks with the confidence of revelation, yet leaves edges unlit. It gives us enough to know where the covenant begins, but not enough to satisfy every historical curiosity. And perhaps that restraint is part of its power. Mystery is not always the absence of truth. Sometimes it is the shape truth takes when its purpose is not to satisfy fascination but to draw us deeper. Because if Scripture had wanted to write the history of all peoples, it could have done so. Instead, it gives us a line, a voice, a garden, a fall, a murder, a genealogy. And through those chosen fragments, it tells us where the broken relationship between God and humanity becomes the center of the story. If you followed this far, you are no longer just hearing a story, you are participating in a search. Share what part of this changed how you see the beginning, not as debate, but as testimony. So the question is no longer who came first. The real question now is why this chosen line mattered so much, that all of biblical history would rise from it. The question is no longer, was there someone before Adam? That question brought us here. It opened the door. It disturbed the surface. It forced us to notice the tensions in Genesis, the double rhythm of creation, the language of the heavenly court, the fear in Cain's voice, the silence surrounding the wider world. But now, standing at the end of this journey, we can see that the deeper question was waiting beneath it all along. Why does it matter? Why does it matter if Adam entered a world already shaped? Why does it matter if Genesis is narrower than we imagined, not weaker, not confused, but deliberately focused? Why does it matter if the Bible is tracing not the beginning of every human detail, but the beginning of a chosen line? Because if Adam was chosen, then humanity is not just a biological event, it is a calling, and that changes everything. It means the story of Genesis is not merely asking how humans appeared, it is asking what humans were for: to bear the image, to guard sacred space, to walk in relationship, to become the meeting place between earth and heaven under the authority of God. Adam is not introduced to answer modern anthropology. He is introduced to begin a covenant drama. And covenant is never random. Covenant means purpose. It means vocation. It means responsibility placed upon fragile shoulders. That is why the fall matters so much. Not simply because a rule was broken, but because a calling was fractured. The one meant to reflect divine order into the world became the one through whom disorder entered the human story. The garden was not only lost as a place, humanity's mission was wounded at its source. And if others existed beyond Adam's immediate line, the conclusion becomes even more powerful, not less. Because then the Bible is not a small tribal story pretending to be universal. It is the story of how one chosen line was set apart for the sake of the whole. That pattern runs through all of Scripture. One family chosen from many, one nation chosen among nations, one king promised, one servant foretold, one Messiah revealed. Not because God cares only for one line, but because through one line he intends to confront the ruin of all. That is the pattern: selection for restoration, narrowing for redemption. A line chosen not to end in itself, but to carry mercy outward. And suddenly Adam stands in a different light. He is not smaller because he may not answer every question about the first humans. He is greater. He becomes the covenant head of a drama that reaches beyond himself. His story is the beginning of sacred relationship, sacred failure, and sacred promise. This is why Genesis remains so powerful. It refuses to flatter our curiosity with easy completeness. It gives us mystery, but not emptiness. It gives us fragments, but chosen fragments. Enough to know that humanity was made for more than survival. Enough to know that being human is not merely to exist, but to answer a summons. Not where we began, but what we were chosen to become. That is the real question. Not whether there were footsteps before Adam's, but whether Adam's story reveals what all our stories were always meant to move toward. Because the Bible does not ultimately leave us at the gate of Eden staring backward into the mist of origins. It pushes us forward through exile, through violence, through covenant, through prophets, through longing toward the restoration of the image that was broken in the beginning. The early chapters of Genesis do not just tell us what humanity lost. They prepare us to ask how humanity can be made whole again. And that is why this story is more dangerous than it first appeared. Because it does not let us remain spectators of an ancient mystery. It turns the question back on us. If humanity was chosen for communion, for holiness, for faithful rule beneath God, what have we done with that calling? If the line of Adam matters because through it the story of restoration begins, then the real burden of Genesis is not hidden in the distant past. It is alive in the present. In every act of rebellion, in every hunger for meaning, in every attempt to rebuild a city east of Eden, in every restless human heart that still carries the memory of a lost garden it cannot name. So perhaps the final revelation is this: the forgotten human story was never only about who came before Adam. It was about why Adam was remembered. Because in that remembrance, Scripture preserves the beginning of the covenant story. The story that dares to say humanity was not made by accident, not abandoned to chaos, and not destined to remain broken forever. And that is the mystery still unfolding. And so the question follows you not back into ancient time, but into your own life. If Adam was chosen, then so are you not for perfection, but for responsibility. Not to know everything, but to live faithfully within what has been revealed. The beginning was never about information. It was about formation. Your legacy is not what you discover, but what you pass on: faith, wisdom, restraint, courage. Even outside Eden, meaning was not lost. It had to be lived. So walk carefully, build wisely, remember deeply, Because the story of humanity is not finished in the past, it is continued through you. We began with a question, who was here before Adam? But we arrive at something far deeper, what it means to carry a story that did not begin with us, yet now continues through us. Because this mystery was never meant to satisfy curiosity alone, it was meant to awaken awareness, responsibility, purpose. If this journey shifted how you see the beginning, take a moment, like subscribe, and share it with someone who still feels there is more beneath the surface. And leave your thoughts below, not as answers, but as part of the search. Stay with us, because next we step into a question even more unsettling. What if Eden was not the first paradise?